Hi guys, I know this is awfully bizarre the way that we're going to be doing things today, so I'm going to try to simulate this as best I can for you. What we're going to do first today is we have a set of notes that we're going to take. Now, I should probably explain just real briefly. You guys were supposed to have your Unit 1 exam today, but I have to switch things around because we're going synchronous. So what that means is your Unit 1 exam is going to be pushed back to next week. So when I see you guys next Tuesday, we'll have your Unit 1 exam. Today, we're just going to go ahead and start Unit 2. So these items that we're going to cover today are not going to be on your Unit 1 exam, but they will be on your Unit 2 exam, just so you're aware of that. Now, for your Unit 1 exam, again, it's going to be all short answer, just based on what we've covered from day one up through the end of last week. The short answer responses, you give me 2, 3, 4, 5 sentences for each, you're good there. Now, I'm still kind of tweaking some things a little bit, so I can't guarantee you exactly how many questions it's going to be, but it should basically take the whole period. Now, with that said, I do want to go ahead and just start our Unit 2 stuff today, because Unit 2 is going to be criminal law. So what we're going to start with, these set of notes is called Elements of a Crime. So we're going to go over some just real basic things as far as what's required for there to actually be a criminal proceeding that takes place. What we know is for elements of a crime, there are always going to have to be two things. Now, when I say always, there are going to be some different things about it that are going to at least reduce a couple of things about the limits of it. We're going to get to that in a moment here. But first we got to talk about is if there's a crime that takes place, there has to be an act. There has to be the crime itself. There has to be, just for example, the bank has to be robbed. There has to be, something has to be stolen. This is going to be the act. Now, in our justice system and our legal system, really, we use a lot of Latin phrases to explain a few things, mostly because of just kind of our judicial background. But the act itself is called the actus reus. Now, again, this is a Latin phrase, but you have to have this first in order for a crime to be committed. Now, the second part of it is going to be a little bit more complex. Now, we're going to talk about that second part because the other thing that you need is there needs to be what's called a guilty state of mind. Now, when I say there has to be a guilty state of mind, what this is really not the physical act. This is the mental act of committing a crime. You have to know what you're doing. It has to be intentional. It has to be willful. But at the same time, there's this old saying that says, ignorance is not excuse for disobeying the law. If you don't know that it's not a crime, it doesn't mean you're innocent. It simply means that you are unaware of it. Now, in most instances, even if you don't know something is against the law, you can still be convicted of it. So what this is really saying is that you were in the right state of mind. You knew what you were doing. Now, I often kind of bring this up in that you can know what you're doing. You can know that it is or let me say it like this. You don't have to know that it's against the law in order to simply know what you're doing. That's what that's what this is referring to in that this is called the mens rea. The mens rea is going to be the mental state that you are aware of what's taking place. So as just kind of a contrast to this, we can talk about a few different areas where mens rea is not even necessary in order for a crime to be committed. One is the insanity plea. Now, I will tell you this, you can plead insanity as far as a defense to a crime, but pleading insanity is going to be awfully, awfully difficult. And in fact, it kind of depends on where you are, but most states will say that if you're going to plead insanity, you have to have 2 independent psychiatrists sign off that yes, when this act took place, that you were in fact legally insane. Now, that definition is really tough to actually put a finger on because determining if someone is insane is just difficult even for the most experienced psychiatrist or psychologist. It's almost impossible. So if I had to put a number on it, I would say that for every 100 people that try to claim the insanity defense, probably only about one of them is actually going to prove that that's true. Now, proving that's true doesn't necessarily mean that a crime wasn't committed. There are just going to be different levels of punishment if someone is deemed to be insane. Now, we're going to kind of talk about that more a little bit later on, but I want to talk about something that's a little bit more tangible, a little more concrete when it comes to mens rea. What this is really saying is that your state of mind is very different from your motive. State of mind is just simply how aware are you? Do you know what you're doing? Do you know what's going on? Are you in control of your own thoughts, basically? A motive is really just why you did something. It's a reason for an action. Now, I bring this up because there are going to be some crimes where you don't even necessarily need to prove a motive for it. Some of these are like selling alcohol to minors. This is what's called a strict liability offense. Now, we're going to again talk about some more of these strict liability offenses, but something like this states that really you don't even need to have this idea of did you know what you were doing? It's the act itself is criminal, regardless of your state of mind. Now, like I said, we're going to talk about some more examples of this, but a perfect example of strict liability is providing alcohol to minors. It's illegal, and also at the same time, simply just doing this action makes you guilty of it. Now, with that said, I want to kind of shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about the different levels where crimes take place. Now, we were talking about this even in Unit 1. Our federalism system allows us to have differences between federal government and state government. We're going to talk state government first because the overwhelming majority of crime or of laws that are written are at the state level. Again, if I had to put a number on it, I'd say roughly about 96% of all the laws that we follow are going to be our state laws, not federal. Because you have to kind of think there's one federal government passing laws, there are 50 state governments passing their own laws. So state laws are going to drastically outweigh federal. Now, I just want to give you one example of these state laws. Murder is almost always a state issue. Up until just about a year ago, it was exclusively a state issue, where if you are tried for murder in a state, it's up to that state laws. Now, this does actually kind of tie back to what you guys were doing remotely with the Furman versus Georgia case. State laws are in regards to the death penalty as well. States can decide if they want to be a death penalty state or if they do not. It's completely up to them. Up until just about a year ago, the federal government had almost nothing to do with any kind of death penalty. They've somewhat walked that back in about the past year or so. They've taken on some more responsibility and some more power in regards to a federal death penalty, but they are very few and far between. The overwhelming majority of states, or of murder trials and also death penalty are going to come at the state level. Now, in Colorado, we used to be a death penalty state. We have recently rescinded this. But in Colorado, we didn't really use the death penalty that often. Off the top of my head, we hadn't even really used it since, I believe, the mid-1970s. We were supposed to execute someone for a mass murder that occurred back in the 1990s. He was supposed to be executed, if I remember correctly, I think it was just like a couple of years ago, but the governor is going to push back his execution. And then in doing so, he pushed it back beyond the date that we rescinded our death penalty. So he's going to get a reprieve from his death sentence, even though it is just commuted. It's reduced to a life sentence. Now, there are others that are, of course, state issues as well. Robbery, which is taking possession, private property, either by force or threat of force. That's a state issue. Also, arson is when you are going to destroy someone's property by fire. Now, again, we're going to kind of get into more of these a little bit later on. But arson is also a state issue. Assault, physically beating someone, is also a state issue. Drunk driving is a state issue as well. Different states have different levels and different kind of punishments and explanations for what constitutes drunk driving. Just to kind of give you an example, in Colorado, the drunk driving limit is going to be a blood alcohol content of 0.08. In Colorado, it is. If you go to some other states, they are going to have it a little bit different. Some states have it a little bit higher than that at 0.1. Other states are even lower than that at 0.06. So it just depends on what state you're in as to what level they'll accept. Now, also as going as low as shoplifting. This is also going to be a state crime as well. Now, going over the other side of this, we are going to talk about what constitutes some federal crimes. Now, I'm just going to give you guys a handful of examples here, and we're going to kind of talk about a pattern here. So first off, one example of just a federal crime is actions that take place on federal property. Now, it can be a federal building, it can be a federal courthouse, it can even just be a federal national park. That's going to be a particular piece of land that's deemed to be federal property, which means if it's federal property, state laws that that area is in do not apply to that. So I always kind of get the example of, in Colorado, we have multiple federal national parks. Colorado law does not apply to that. So there have been multiple cases of people in Colorado caught with marijuana in the federal park who claim that, no, it's legal in Colorado. Well, no, it's not, because you're on federal property. State laws do not apply to federal property. Only federal laws do. So the federal marijuana law says that it is illegal. Those people are going to be caught and they're going to be convicted, at least for the overwhelming part. Also, federal tax evasion is a federal crime. Now, there are two different kinds of taxation. There are federal taxes and there are state taxes. If you don't pay your federal taxes, the federal government can come after you. You don't pay your state taxes, the state government will come after you. But they are two different entities. Now also, there's mail fraud and drug trafficking. Now I kind of put these together because this also just kind of feeds into the big theme here. Something that I'll just kind of highlight for you. As far as a theme goes for this, you can see that if this crime is crossing state boundaries, if it goes from one state into another, then the federal government gets involved. They have jurisdiction if it involves more than one state. Now, there are some crimes that are both state and federal crimes where you can be charged for both. Now, it's basically one incident, but in that one incident, you're breaking a federal law and you're breaking a state law. So it's possible, depending on what it is, you can be prosecuted by the federal government and you can be prosecuted by the state in which this crime takes place. So again, I'll give you an example. Possession of illegal drugs can be a federal charge and it can be a state charge because it's against federal law and most likely it's against state laws as well. So they can prosecute you from both levels. Also, bank robbery can be federal and state. This is going to be an issue because banks are going to be charging or are going to be working over state lines. So robbing a bank can be considered federal. It can also be considered a state crime. Now also, racially motivated murder or hate crimes are always kind of a strange sticking point because determining why this crime was committed, if it was based on race or another specific group, it can be difficult to determine really the motive behind it. But if it can be proven that it was racially motivated or if it was a hate crime, then yes, you can be charged for a federal crime as well. But it's also a state issue, so you can be charged for both. Now, I will tell you, I know that this is far from perfect. We're going to do the best that we can for these couple of days. I'm hoping that Microsoft Teams will work out for us so that we can do things a little bit differently. But this is it as far as just the very beginning of our elements of a crime notes are concerned. So you need to hang on to those. When we go back live, we're going to build on what we did today.